Welcome to the Darkstream, Vox Day, voxday.blogspot.com, and I'm pleased to be able to say that the robots were not an issue tonight. Apparently the robots have been vanquished. It's nice to see some of you already showing up and waiting. Good evening to the Dread Ilk. Good evening to the Evil Legion of Evil. And I'm already seeing some bear signs being thrown out there, so good evening to the bears. Always good to see you. So tonight, I want to talk about yet another effective bit of rhetoric thrown out to us by the God Emperor Donald Trump, first of his line. And he talked about how Israel's wall works. And I thought that that was a remarkably effective comment, especially in light of what's going on with regards to the federal shutdown. So why is the president bringing up Israel's wall? Well, it's doubly effective. It's effective on multiple levels. And the main reason is that on the one hand, it effectively addresses the argument by many opponents of the big beautiful wall who claim that walls don't work. Now, this is complete nonsense. The Berlin Wall worked. People were not going over, around, or through the Berlin Wall very often. Also, Israel's wall works very well. It's not utterly impermeable. Their enemies are pretty skilled when it comes to tunneling and so forth. And yet, they've been able to significantly reduce the number of attacks coming from those directions where the walls have been built. But there's another aspect to this that it's possible that the media has not yet understood. And that is, now that the president has linked the wall to Israel, that means that all of the morality-based arguments against the U.S. wall are also naturally directed against Israel's wall. And this is something that the Democrats, who are very, very heavily dependent upon AI PAC money, are not going to be willing to go. When the president demands to know if he needs to pull out that rhetorical weapon, then he has the ability to say, how can you say that a wall is immoral for Americans, but is moral for Israelis? And if walls are immoral, if we cannot fund a wall, then how can we send any money at all to an immoral state building an immoral wall, maintaining an immoral wall? So what he's doing by linking Israel's wall to the big beautiful wall that he's going to build, that he intends to build, and that I believe that he will go ahead and leave the government shut down until he gets what he demands in order to build it. He's set the stage rhetorically to put very, very intense pressure on the Democrats, who are, of course, are trying to put pressure on him through the shutdown. And so, as with all of these things, it requires discipline and determination to see the matter through. If Trump backs down on this, he is going to have very, very little credibility with his backers, with his supporters, with the people that he needs. Here's an interesting fact from Chicago typewriter author Brandon Fiadino. Israel had more than 10,000 crossings prior to 2013. It went down to less than 200 after that, when the wall first began going up, and next to none in 2017. And so, as for those of you who are saying that the wall doesn't matter, all that matters is that we deport people, you have to start somewhere. You need that initial win. If you can't get the wall, you can't get the deportations. You have to start somewhere. And the first rule of triage and medicine and emergency medicine and so forth is you've got to stop the bleeding. And so, Cephas also has a good point. What good is deportation when they just hop back? So the wall is the first step. It's not the final step. It's not the be-all and end-all solution to the problems and challenges that the United States is facing. But it is the first step in addressing those problems. And that's why it's so important. And that's why the Democrats are willing to go to such lengths in order to try to shut it down. I'm encouraged by the fact that Trump was willing to actually let the government shut down this time. I hope that he remembers the lesson from past shutdowns when George Bush and I believe before him Ronald Reagan ended up waving the white flag and giving the congressional Democrats what they wanted because they didn't have the courage to see it through. Trump has at least begun that process, and he is going to have to see it through. The credibility of his presidency, the credibility of his administration depends upon this. The two things that he was elected to do were to build the wall and drain the swamp. He needs to do those two things. Otherwise, there's no reason for him to even run for re-election. He's already accomplished the one most important thing that he had to accomplish, and that was keeping the United States out of war with Russia by beating Hillary Clinton. I believe there's a very good chance that we would have already had at least some very nasty exchanges with Russia, with the Russian military, possibly lost an aircraft carrier or two. Probably the Ukraine would be entirely occupied by Russia now if Hillary Clinton had been elected president, because she was planning to allow Ukraine, to invite Ukraine to join NATO. And that's something that Russia will never permit. They will go to war rather than permit the US and NATO to put troops and military bases right up against their border in Ukraine. So even if he does nothing else, Trump has already been one of the greatest presidents of the last 150 years. No question. But that doesn't mean that he has done what he was elected to do. Most people didn't realize that the U.S., that a Hillary Clinton-led U.S. was very, very likely to start a war with Russia. So that's not something that he's going to get much credit for. It's not something that he's been willing to point out. And so when you look at his campaign promises, the two big promises were to drain the swamp, which he is working on. There's no question he's working on. If you look at the number of politicians with seniority, if you look at the number of high-ranking federal bureaucrats, whether they're in the FBI, NSA, other places, the number of senior bureaucrats who have left their positions is incredible. Now, I know we're all disappointed that we haven't seen the sort of events that QAnon and others have been predicting. We'd like to see those events. We'd like to see it happen. It hasn't happened yet. Doesn't mean it won't happen. But, all right, we're going to get rid of these guys who are trying to hijack the chat. Just a warning, folks. If you try to hijack the chat, you will never comment on this channel again. Okay? So if you come in here with your agendas and try to start up your own unrelated discussion in the chat, you'll be gone. So don't do that. Anyhow, the important thing is that the fact that President Trump was willing to embrace the government shutdown, that he was willing to let it happen, and that he hasn't backed down, is a very good sign that he is finally really focusing on his campaign promises. I think that the lesson of the 2018 elections was very clear. You're not going to talk anybody around. You're not going to convince the other side to meet you halfway. And as for those who are concerned about the fact that the House is going to control Congress, understand that Republican presidents have always been more successful when they have a Democratic House to work with, because it's a lot easier to oppose people who are openly your enemy than people who are constantly stabbing you in the back and constantly trying to undermine you from inside your own operation. And so I think that we're actually going to see a stronger, more effective president with a oppositional House than we did with a Republican House that Trump felt he had to at least try to work with. I mean, we knew that it wasn't going to work. We knew that Paul Ryan was going to sabotage him and so forth. But now that's not a problem anymore. Now Trump can return to what he's doing best, which is pressuring and negotiating opposing parties. Was I not happy with North Korea? I mean, it was encouraging. It was fine. It was great. But it wasn't what he was elected to do. And that's one of the big problems that presidents always have. Whether it's a Republican or a Democratic president, they have their agenda, but they run into the inevitable problem that anyone with authority and responsibility has, which is how do you balance addressing the urgent while simultaneously addressing the important. And so if you think about how many things that a president has to deal with, how many directions a president is being pulled in by all of his advisors, all of whom have different interests, are trying to advise the president to go in different directions, that sort of thing. I mean, it's kind of a miracle that anything at all gets done. And I don't know if you've ever seen the British television show from the early 80s called Yes Minister, and there's another series called Yes Prime Minister. And it was a very amusing television show about how the bureaucrats invariably do whatever they want to do and just manipulate the politicians, and pretty much avoid changing anything, paying any attention to what the politicians say. And, it's a comedy, of course, but there is an element of truth to that, and that's why it's so funny. Let's see, how many times does Vox Day have to remind the hand-wringers that Spain was completely occupied by the Moors before they kicked them out? Yeah, But it's hard. It's hard for people to grasp that. And for many reasons. I mean, it's painful to think that the U.S. might have to go through what it's going to go through, and so completely unnecessarily. You know, there's absolutely no reason for the USA to go through the violence and the tragedy and the conflict that it is destined to go through now because of the shameless self-interest of the immigrant lobbies, especially the Jewish lobby, that pushed through the changes in U.S. immigration law, naturalization law in 1965, and the refusal of the politicians and, frankly, the American people to address the situation when it was easy to control. This could have all been very easily handled. Even back in 1986, there was a chance to address it, but Reagan blew it. And, you know, nothing is going to demolish Reagan's reputation more than that 1986 amnesty agreement. You know, to such an extent that he may come to be defined by that more than winning the Cold War, and more than the recovery of the economy during the 1980s. You know, it's a tremendous tragedy and a totally unnecessary tragedy, but then many tragedies are. Let me give you an example. I mean, you know perfectly well that most people now still don't believe that there's a problem. Let me give you an example. Let me also share a little bit with you. You may see these red books here. I mentioned them the other night. That was my Christmas gift from Space Bunny. It was wonderful. Something I've wanted for years. It's a 7-volume set. It's called A History of the Peninsular War. It's by one of my favorite military historians, Charles Oman. He wrote The Art of War in the Middle Ages, which has long been a favorite of mine. Anyhow, it's this beautiful set published in I think the first volume was published in 1902, Oxford at the Clarendon Press. Just so you understand, my wife is an inveterate apex predator. She loves to hunt down a bargain. So she found this set at about 5% of what it goes for, which is kind of incredible. I don't want people thinking that we're running around blowing that kind of money on the libraries. And the books were in fantastic condition too. But let me read to you, I've been reading it the past few days, and let me read to you something that I think is very, very relevant to the current situation. And this is the frustration of the British general, the commander-in-chief of the British forces in Spain and Portugal. And he's frustrated at the attitude of the people in northwest Spain during the French invasion. And the reason that they are not concerned about it is because none of the French are anywhere near them. And so it says, Leon and Old Castile had, as we've already had occasion to remark, been far less energetic than other parts of the peninsula in raising new troops and coming forward with contributions to the national exchequer. They had done no more than furnish the 10,000 men of Cuesta's disorderly army of Castile, a contingent utterly out of proportion with their population and resources. Nor did they seem to realize the scandal of their own sloth and procrastination. More had expected to see every town full of new levies, undergoing drill before marching to the Ebro, to discover magazines accumulated in important places like Ciudad Rodrigo and Salamanca, to find the military and civil officials busily working for the armies at the front. Instead, he found an unaccountable apathy. Even after the reports of Espinosa and Gamonal had come to hand, the people and the authorities alike seemed to be living in a sort of fool's paradise, disbelieving the gloomy news that arrived, or at least refusing to recognize that the war was now at their own doors. More feared that this came from a want of patriotism or of courage. As a matter of fact, the people's hearts were sound enough, but they had still got Balin on the brain. They simply failed to recognize the full horror of the situation. That their armies were not merely beaten, but dispersed, that the way to Madrid was open to Bonaparte escaped them. This attitude of mind enraged Moore. Now how many of you feel like Moore? How many of you feel like General Moore? They're just totally unable to understand the situation that they're in. Very, very few Americans understand the situation that they're in. They don't understand that their children and grandchildren are being doomed to conflict and war. They don't understand how dreadful the situation is. The United States has been subject to the largest invasion in human history, the largest movement of peoples in human history. And yet, just like the Spanish, who were not concerned about the fact that the emperor of all Europe, because at this time, Napoleon had already been crowned emperor. He'd already defeated Austria. He'd already defeated the Prussians. He'd driven the Russians back. And now he was turning his attention to taking over Spain, which had hitherto been his ally. And at the time of that Moore is writing that, the French had about 100,000 troops in Spain. They eventually ended up with around 400,000 before the end. But the thing is that you've got 100,000 troops. Napoleon has actually entered Spain. He's actually physically in Spain. They're marching on the road to Madrid, the Spanish capital at the time. And yet the people who are in the northern part of Spain are just, it's probably fine. Nothing's wrong in my backyard. Okay. There's a few strange people about. There's a little diversity about, but they're so nice. They're nice people. They're just like us. I can tell you that's not true. I have lived outside of the USA for most of my adult life. When I am in Japan, when I'm in Italy, then I behave as much like the locals as I can. Why? Because I'm by myself. Because I don't want to create problems. But it changes completely when you see large numbers of people. This happens with Brits. This happens with Americans. This happens with everybody. When there are enough of them, they don't even bother to so much as learn the native language. I know British people who have lived in Italy for over 20 years and maybe speak 15 words of Italian. They don't have to. They live in an expat community surrounded mostly by other Brits, all of whom speak English. They spend their time talking to their friends in England or their English friends in Spain and so forth. And so it's never going to be the same. The United States is never going to be able to return to the kind of homogeneous country, homogeneous, peaceful, advanced country that it was in the 1950s. It will never be able to do that again. Even if there's a mass deportation and a restoration of the sort of homogeneous nation that there was before, the trauma of that event is going to permanently affect the shape of the country, the shape of the nation. LRN News says, it's the same in Montreal. There's a sizable English community. Some have been living there for generations and still don't speak a word of French. Yeah, so there will be no assimilation. There will be no peace. And, the libertarian dream is as totally utopian and totally unattainable as the communist dream. Ironically enough, the idea of communism, that you can have a functioning economy without price information, the price information provided by the market, is totally false. The idea that you can retain the traditions and values and culture and habits and laws of a nation that has been subject to mass immigration, it's totally impossible. And so, it's just tragic. It is tragic. I mean, think about how Oman describes the fate of the Spanish. He talks about how they did not recognize the full horror of the situation. What was going to happen in Spain, what was going to happen in their part of Spain, was terrible. Hundreds of thousands of people died. Spanish, French, British. And that's going to be so minor in comparison to what is going to happen in the United States. And also now, thanks in part to Angela Merkel, the same thing is going to happen on a smaller scale in Europe. And it's the saddest thing, the tragic thing, is that it was always totally unnecessary. Always totally and absolutely unnecessary. And so Lin Jin says, what Oman book? This is a history of the Peninsular War. I was quoting from volume 1. And so, now these things, you can argue, if you look at it from the grand historical perspective, these things have to happen. People fail to teach the integral lessons to their children. Other interested parties come in and act as a adulterating and weakening force. But the trend is turning. The wall is the first sign of that. The election of Donald Trump is another sign of that. And so all of these things are part of the growing and rising trend of nationalism that is currently sweeping the world. And so I would encourage you to continue to offer your support to Trump. Stop whining about, oh, he's going to cuck, oh, he's giving in. Remember, you can't always predict what Trump is going to do by the noises he makes. At the end of the day, either we are going to get the wall built or we won't. And if it's not built, then that will bring about the kind of events that we were talking about sooner rather than later. It's very, very unlikely. It was always very unlikely that Trump was going to be able to solve the whole thing. At best, he might delay things. At best, he might reduce the price that is going to end up being paid. But we always knew that. I was writing about that in 2015. And so, what do we do? All we can do is work for the best, hope for the best, and pray for the best. But it's important. It's very, very important to understand what's going on in the historical sense. And to understand that the behavior that you're seeing out of the people that frustrates you so much is totally normal. The Spanish were behaving the same way in the 19th century. So it shouldn't shock you that Americans are behaving that way or that Americans are behaving that way today too. My question, how do so many illegals end up in one town all the way in New Jersey? Because expats and immigrants always congregate. Where you get one, you will get more. It's true everywhere and with every people. I embrace diversity because there's actually lots of ways to deal with diversity. The Spanish dealt with their French diversity very effectively. Diversity never lasts. And here's the thing that's always kind of funny when people talk about that sort of thing. Where do you think the homogeneous nations came from in the first place? Homogeneous nations are born from conflict within heterogeneous nations. So when you transform a homogeneous nation into a heterogeneous nation, all you're doing is assuring that there will be one or more homogeneous nations in the future. It's guaranteed. No empire ever lasts. Let's see. Anyhow, go ahead and I'll take a few questions. Also, unfortunately, things have not been going great with the dog. The crucial numbers are continuing to improve somewhat, but he just hasn't been able to keep on weight, and there's some other issues. So those of you who are inclined to pray for my family, I would appreciate if you would continue to do so, and pray for the dog as well. He's an exceptionally nice dog. I'm hoping that he'll fully recover, and I'll be able to introduce him to you on a future Darkstream. But it's difficult. It's a little disappointing. We were feeling really optimistic, or starting to feel optimistic, on Christmas Eve. We got that good report, and actually that crucial number, is continuing to improve. We found out today, but it's still touch and go, which is particularly difficult, because it's Space Bunny's dog, and she's very close with him. Anyhow, so questions. Is civil war between liberals and conservatives likely? No, it's mostly going to be ethnic. I hear people talking about how Japan needs immigration and diversity to survive. That's totally insane. It's totally false. If you could save only one nation from globalism, which one would you save? I don't actually know. I mean, I can think of good reasons for about 4 or 5 different ones. Which area of the USA do you believe will organize by common ground and rise to become the most powerful nation state on the continent? Well, I would expect that probably the upper Midwest. You know, you're going to see whoever it's going to be wherever is most homogenous, and probably the most intelligent is the most likely to succeed. And places where it's cold and so forth, and it's harder to survive without being propped up by government transfer payments. That's where you're likely going to see the most successful people be. But it's hard to say. I mean, California is probably going to be completely dominated, taken over by the Mexicans. Just finished History of Strategy. It was a great intro. I was pleasantly surprised by how funny Van Creveld is. Yeah, great book. If you haven't read A History of Strategy yet, you really must. You cannot possibly consider yourself even partway educated on history and war if you have not read that book. Unless, of course, you've read everything that he's writing about in it. Why are Richard Spencer and friends embracing paganism? Because atheism doesn't provide any spiritual utility. Man needs to fill that spiritual vacuum. So what they're doing is they're basically turning to their D&D manuals to try to invent some kind of religion because they dislike Christianity. It's not going to work. Modern European paganism is essentially, I've got there's a whole Darkstream on it, you can look it up, but it's basically akin to live action role playing. The thing is, none of the people who adopt that religion actually believe in it by their own description. If you talk to them, you immediately get treated to a Jordan Peterson like meandering exposition on metaphor and this, that, and the other thing. That's why it's paganism, when it was actually genuinely believed, when was actually practiced by highly intelligent, virtuous pagans, still lost out to Christianity in the Roman Empire. The paganism, paganism 4.0 has no hope. That being said, Christianity today is badly converged, badly invaded by the enemy. There are way too many wolves in sheep's clothing in the pulpits, and Christianity desperately needs another Reformation. It needs Inquisition. It needs a very, very thorough cleaning. So I do not oppose any of the serious atheist and pagan criticisms of the current Christian churches and Christian organizations, because it's a lot of it is totally fake Christianity. I call it churchianity. Philip says, your take on Taliban IQ was discussed in Swedish right libertarian talk radio yesterday. That's funny. What did they think? Were they inclined to buy into Talib's neo-Petersonian trans-definitionalism, or did they understand what I was talking about? Let's see. Does it make sense to question someone's status as a Christian if they don't want to hold out on sex until marriage? Not their status. I mean, I think that you have the right to call them on their failing to live up to their standards. But, just because you're a bad Christian doesn't mean that you're not a Christian. Of course, I mean, they could be a fake too. You never know. But there's if you're a Christian yourself, you have a responsibility to help hold your Christian brothers and sisters accountable. When will Dawkins and Harris realize that their activist atheism opened the doors to Islam? They already realize that. They realized that probably 4 or 5 years ago. That's why you saw them really dial down their attacks on Christianity. And and that was also kind of why they were attacking faith and attacking belief, because they wanted to attack Christianity. They knew they could attack Christianity, but they were unable to attack Islam. And also, they didn't realize that secular humanism was going to be such a complete failure. They actually believed that secular humanism was capable of filling the spiritual void and replacing Christianity. Now, of course, they have a glimpse of what post-Christian Europe, post-Christian England is going to look like, and they are terrified. Let's see here. I can't stand long enough to make it through an Orthodox service. Let's see here. Were things this bad in the USA in the 2000s? I feel like the multicultural ethnic conflict wasn't so bad back then, and it has gotten much worse in modern society. Well, it wasn't as bad. I mean, the problem was already there. The cake was already baked, but we hadn't crossed some of the tipping points that have been crossed. I mean, now, the Somalis in Minneapolis control the political system there. It's astonishing. I mean, as someone who went to school in Minneapolis in the 80s, I can't even fathom what that must look like. I don't want to see what it looks like. Thoughts on natural law rules out contraception, lots of Christian sexual ethics. Yeah, we're not going to get into that. Let's see. How do people not realize that with mass immigration, the host nations are the ones that lose out because they lose territory to people that already have homelands? Most people don't think at all. They certainly don't think in a grand strategic scale like that. What's your opinion on the cosmological argument? Which one? What's your opinion on H.P. Lovecraft? Wonderful horror writer. Very interesting. I mean, truly a unique talent. How do you reconcile the question of Christianity's validity to the decades gap between the death of Christ and the early church? I don't think there's any question of Christianity's validity. I mean, my belief in the validity of Christianity has nothing to do with the historical record. Nothing at all. It has to do with what I see in the world. The Christian model is the only one that I feel accurately describes the world that we observe today. By 2030, white warlords are going to be sacking Minneapolis. I wouldn't think by 2030, but quite possibly by 2040. Why don't people realize that when the Germans are a minority in Germany, they will not have power in the country anymore and be ruled over by others? Well, I mean, a lot of them do, but they've been propagandized into believing that their blood is evil and that they have to perish in order to repent for the Holocaust. I mean, you'd be surprised at how many Germans are fundamentally, depressed to the point of national suicide. Let's see. Yeah, look up Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. It points out the situation we are now in back in 1968. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. All of this stuff was totally obvious. Absolutely and totally obvious. It was obvious to the people who pushed for it. It was obvious to the people who opposed it. And yet most of the people just blithely ignored it. And the only thing that they paid attention to was the evil wizards telling the people that the dragons were going to eat them if you let them come in and grow up. They said, well, no, that's anti-dragon. That's racist. That's evil. That's wrong. They're just nice dragons. They're going to help you become rich. Well, now the dragons are all grown up. At what point could you see the situation clearly? I was a little late on it. I didn't see it until probably, I would say 1995, 1996. That was when I really began to correctly see what was going on. I used to pride myself. I was a NCAA Division I sprinter. Had lots of African teammates. I've got Mexican relatives. I used to pride myself on, being colorblind, all that kind of stuff. Only judging people by the individual. All that kind of civic nationalist crap. I mean, I was a total civic nationalist. And it wasn't until I began, it really was my visit to Japan that began to transform my thinking, but it wasn't fully realized until 1995 or so. Let's see. I am Canadian. Canada is going down the fast way. Yeah, it is. It's actually kind of remarkable how fast Canada is declining. What's your response to the capitalist argument that America needs to replace the aging population with immigrants? Total bullshit. The only reason that you would ever need to do that, that argument assumes that you need to have permanent growth. That's not possible. You're going to crash that way. The people who are pointing that out are trying to maintain the debt pyramid. They need more debt. So, and you can't replace a high performance 105 IQ population with a low performance, low trust, 90 IQ population and think it's going to work at all. Did the globalists get control through cleverness or just luck? Well, they got control through greed. They got control through the greed and the moral weakness and corruptibility of man. Remember this. See, John 14 is just stupid. I'm a civic nationalist because I refuse to engage in racial conflict with people based on their skin color. Yeah, well, John, they'll engage in it with you. And it doesn't take two to war. It takes two to tango, takes one to war. You're not a civic nationalist. You're a loser. You and your family are going to die because you're not willing to engage in the conflict that is going to find you. You can feel virtuous if you like, but it's not going to save you. How do we fight against despair and apathy? Well, this is why Christianity matters. We always have hope. We always have hope. What does Jesus Christ give us? He gives us hope that this world doesn't matter that much. Don't fear those who can only kill the body. At your convenience, can you please speak your thoughts on the new digital smart city in Neom, Saudi Arabia? I don't think it's going to last very long. Let's see here. Why do you keep asking about Peterson's strange diet? I don't give a damn about Peterson's strange diet. Don't ask me about that again. You've asked that question like 30 times in the past few chats. if I don't answer a question when you've asked it twice, just drop it. I'm clearly not interested. How do you fight toxic solipsism that causes people to be so willfully ignorant about their country's impending demise? I mean, there's only so much you can do. If someone's solipsistic, if someone is narcissistic, what can you do? All they care about is staring at their own belly button. Leave them to it. But don't count on them and don't try to save them. Why won't the USA go the way of Brazil instead of civil war? Because it involves too much transformation of the system, and the competing forces are too different. In Brazil, you had a small population. You didn't really have a small population of diverse peoples, and there was no one party in control per se. It's just kind of an accommodation that was reached. But you can't take an existing system and break it and expect that it's going to work out peacefully. I guess I would say the main reason is Brazil does not represent the movement of peoples from one space into another as much as it tends to involve people that were being brought in. I'll have to think about it some more, but I know a bit about Brazil thanks to some friends of mine, but there's no way that the U.S. is just going to peacefully decline into something like Brazil. Let's see. What do you think of the UK government letting Chinese companies such as Huawei run its upcoming 5G superstructure? It doesn't really matter whose servant they are. I mean, they're going to need the Chinese to run it because they're not going to be able to run it themselves. C says, here in Brazil, there was a party in control. We took them down. Okay, well, that may be your answer right there. Buonasera. Give me one example of multiculturalism working. The closest that you probably have is something like Switzerland, where they have fairly rigid differences between the language regions and the cantons. If you go to Zurich, it's very, very different than if you go to Ticino. They have different laws. They even moved populations at one point, so you had Protestant and Catholic cantons. Now that's weakened, I understand, over the last 30, 40 years, but it is a working multicultural system, but it's very, very segregated, and legally, structurally, linguistically, and so forth. And so I'm pretty sure that's not what the globalists and multiculturalists have in mind. Our elite class are a major problem. As long as they're okay and can escape to their enclaves, they don't care about the rest of the country. Well, that's true. That's absolutely true. Hey, look, I told YouTube to remind me when you streamed, and of course it didn't. Honestly, I don't think that that's YouTube. I think that they just don't bother getting these things to work right. Have you read Lord Valentine's Castle? Yes, twice. Do you think that world government is how the author imagines the best government? No, I think that he's just taking he's taking a medieval empire and blowing it up to a global scale. It's a fascinating book. I really enjoy it. I enjoyed it even more the second time than I did reading it when I was in high school. But I don't see that as being any sort of globalist fetish. Is Calvin Coolidge your favorite president? I like Calvin Coolidge. I like Andrew Jackson. And I like Donald Trump. Vox, the immigrants in the U.S. Army are mostly from gangs, and their kids who live on post are very racist. I'm not surprised at all. I think that the racism of the next generation is going to astonish their grandfathers and parents. Have you heard Pendulum or Prodigy? I'm assuming you're talking about the bands. Of course I know Prodigy. How do you feel about separatists? I think that they are probably right. I think that they're probably inevitable. I think more and more people are going to become separatists. Anyhow, a couple other things. There's 2 days left to support the Alt Hero Q campaign. I would strongly urge you to support that if you haven't already. We've got some Chuck Dixon's doing some great work. Helix Hayes is doing some amazing art, and I think you'll enjoy it. If you haven't read Jordanetics yet, you definitely want to pick up a copy. I was just, I don't know if you saw that clip of Jack Posobiec and Donald Trump Jr. with Jordan Peterson, but Jack Posobiec is definitely going to be reading it now, and it'd be interesting to see if Donald Trump Jr. has moved to read it after experiencing Petersonian baffle-garble for himself. Are you temperamentally a populist, or do you just think we have a problem with our elite class? I'm temperamentally an elitist. I'm naturally an elitist. I was actually encouraged to, to use the word groomed would be too strong a word, but I was definitely encouraged to consider putting myself on the congressional track to become a U.S. congressman. Back when I was in college, I did not want to go that route. And what I saw inside the political system was enough to make me want to stay very, very far away from it. And I'm glad I did. So, but I am naturally an elitist. Those are the people that I tend to be most comfortable with. But I believe that their path is wrong. And so my sympathies are definitely with the populists. But I do speak the language, of the elitists pretty naturally. Do you play any instruments? I used to play piano, played a little bass. Didn't do either very well. So anyhow, well, that's enough for tonight. Thank you for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Don't despair. Don't be afraid. The important thing to remember, and this is the best thing about the Bible, is that it tells you who wins in the end. So we know we're on the winning side. Have a good evening. We'll look forward to seeing that big, beautiful wall being built soon. And we'll look forward to seeing you at the next Darkstream. Have a good evening.